3 billion, 1.4% of GDP.
But
you
Lewis,
increased.
We had the highest growth in the G7.
And 14 years of stagnant
We had 13 months, actually, because they have been ruinous. And those are things that are to do with their choices, not as was the case back in 2019 on things like COVID, the Russian war and so on.
Someone who has been made available, though, is Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and Conservative MP for Central Devon. Grateful to him as always. Mel Stride, before we turn to the budget, which will, of course, dominate the political week, I want to turn to the Trump peace plan. President Zelensky saying he has to choose between dignity and the loss of the United States as an ally. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the president did say last night that this isn't his final position, and I'm pleased to hear that, because I think a situation where Ukraine might be expected to give up the whole of the Donbass, limit its army to 600,000, undertake never to join NATO, and be left in a position where it didn't have sufficient security guarantees is not a good outcome. And indeed, one which I think Ukraine would be highly unlikely to sign up to.
And we couldn't support it. You couldn't support it.
Well, on the basis that I've just set out, I don't think that is tenable. But it is good that the president has said what he said last night, and it's also good that he's engaged and so determined to put the focus of the United States on driving some kind of appropriate just peace in that conflict. But look, what we've got to have is our government and our Prime Minister involved in the diplomacy around that to try and get this deal into a position where both sides can actually sign up to it.
Let's turn to the budget. Is there a case, and perhaps the Chancellor herself may have contributed to this, but is there a case to say that there's a little bit too much doomsaying about the UK economy, but actually by comparison to many of our competitors, particularly our European competitors, Germany, Italy, France, others, UK isn't doing too badly, is it?
Well, I'm afraid that's rather contradicted by most of the surveys of business, for example. Now, the Institute
GDP
of
growth isn't too bad, inflation isn't too bad, unemployment's not great, but it's at 5%.
Well, let's run through the economic metrics. Inflation is about twice what it was when they took over. Unemployment's at a 5-year high. Growth per capita this year, according to the IMF, will be the second lowest in the G7 and the lowest in the G7 next year. None of these things are pointing in the right direction. And, of course, we're mounding up loads of debt on the servicing costs on which are about 100 billion a year, or twice what we spend on defence. We're in a real absolute bind. So when it comes to confidence, nobody wants to talk down the economy, although the government did that, Lewis. If you remember when they got elected, they started going on about this fictitious £22 billion black hole. Extinguished the
economic inheritance
spirits.
Wasn't great, was it, Mel Stride?
Well, we had COVID. We had the Ukraine-Russia war, which imported substantial inflation to our shores.
14 years of stagnant living standards.
On the day of the general election, we had near record level of employment, near record low level of unemployment. We had inflation down to bang on the 2% target. It's now almost double that. And we had the highest growth in the G7.
And 14 years of stagnant living standards.
We had 13 months, actually, consecutive months of rising real wages.
14 years of stagnant living standards.
If you're talking about real wage growth and growth in the economy, then it is fair to say that since about 2008, actually, before we first came to office in 2010, we have had growth that has underperformed, and productivity.
And in 14 years, you couldn't arrest it.
As underperformed. Well, we inherited in 2010 a massive deficit, if you remember, over 10% of GDP at that point.
Rachel Reeves inherited a country with stagnant living standards.
We had to bring that down, and we did. Well, we've gone through the arguments around COVID. We shrank the economy, Lewis, by 10% overnight.
Yes, although, as you know, that was not the whole picture.
We avoided mass unemployment. And we did it by intervening in the way that we did, and we could only do that because we had a strong enough economy to sustain that.
Well, it looks pretty clear that Rachel Reeves this week will freeze income tax thresholds. That's clearly going to be a centre of political conflagration for the week. Your leader, Kemi Badenoch, says that Reeves should apologise if she does it. Would you therefore like to apologise for doing it from 2021 to 2028?
So the distinction between those two situations is that Rachel Reeves has made countless promises that she would not do that. It would breach her manifesto commitments.
Well,
you
always pledged to keep tax down, and you kept that. Was a huge tax grab.
We're talking specifically here about the Rachel Reeves situation, which is one of a breach of the manifesto commitment, if that is what she does, and it does seem highly likely, I agree. And I think under those circumstances, not only should she apologise. I think she should consider her position, actually, because she will have been in a position where she has clearly breached her manifesto commitments not to increase taxes on working people. It's hard to argue, I think, that by freezing the thresholds within the income tax regime, you're not affecting.
You pledged not to increase national insurance in 2019, and you did exactly that.
Well, look, we can keep endlessly visiting the past, but the budget is almost on us. It's happening on Wednesday. It is this government that is in charge, and no, I don't accept that. But I think the situation here is that the clear promises were made, manifesto commitments were made. They've been endless breaches of the commitments made to the British people. Look, during the run-up to the general election, they said they wouldn't be putting up taxes left, right and centre. They had about £7 billion worth of tax increases in the manifesto. They came forward with £30 billion worth.
Well, you said in 2019 you would keep tax down.
£40 billion worth of tax increases.
Well, you said in 2019 you keep tax down. You're criticising Rachel Reeves for sticking, in the main, to the tax freezes, to the freezes in income tax thresholds that you yourself committed to until 2028. Do you know how much that represented in terms of a tax increase in those years, Mel Stride?
Well, I do know that if you look at the interplay of the reductions that we also had for an average earner, in fact, you were looking at the lowest marginal rate of tax since the 1970s.
43 billion, 1.4% of GDP
but
you
Lewis,
increase by freezing tax thresholds, the thing that you are now criticising Rachel Reeves for simply extending probably by a couple of years.
But these are two very different situations.
Why?
Because after 2019, we had something called COVID that shrank the UK economy
and she's still dealing with the after effects.
That shrank the UK economy by over 10%. It was the biggest economic hit since the Great Frost of about 1714.
And Brexit.
And we had Brexit, and we had the Russia-Ukraine war, and inflation went up to over 11% at the back end of 2022. Those were external shocks that had to be dealt with, and of course they came with a price tag, and of course there were fiscal consequences, including around tax. What we're looking at here is a government that basically said one thing to the British people during the run-up to that election and then did a completely different set of things afterwards, and they have been ruinous. And those are things that are to do with their choices, not as was the case back in 2019 on things like COVID, the Russian war and so on.
It seems certain that the Chancellor also will abolish the two-child benefit cap, which of course was introduced by your government. This is going to cost her about $3 billion or so. I mean, there isn't there, Mel Stride, quite a good reason to do that, because it has been ruinous for a whole generation of children, pushing them into child poverty since that was introduced in 2017.
The best way out of poverty is through work, is not through benefits.
The kids can't work.
It's through getting people off work. Well, their parents can, and in many cases can.
And in some cases
that is the most important
thing. And in many cases are.
Indeed, and none of those things negate the point that I'm making. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that when it comes to having a larger family, and we're talking families of 3 children or more here, the first 2 are still covered within the benefits system. I don't think it's unreasonable that people that get up in the morning, work very long hours, strive hard, earn their money, pay their tax, have to take tough decisions about the size of the family that they can afford.
Do you know how many children have been pushed into
poverty? Shouldn't be taken by those that are on benefits.
Do you know how many children have been pushed into poverty as a result of that policy?
The IFS says that about 600,000 will be taken out of poverty if the cap was abolished. And I understand those figures. But there are the points that I'm making around the best way out of poverty. And we demonstrated that in government. We had 200,000 reduction of children in absolute poverty after housing costs. So work is the way to do that, not providing ever larger amounts.
It was introduced, the child benefit cap, as you know, Mel Stride, by a very wealthy man, George Osborne, who today makes millions selling his services to banks and financial institutions all over the world. He has, for what is many people, for many of these children, unimaginable wealth. That policy has taken away resources from the poorest children in the country. Does that not make you uncomfortable?
It's not a zero-sum game, Lewis. Societies and economies don't work like that. What we should be doing is celebrating and encouraging.
Well, it's been a transfer away from
what we should be. No, you grow the size of the cake by freeing people up,
which hasn't happened.
Well, it has to a substantial degree, but we need to see more of it. But what you need is a society in which government is of an optimum size, not over large and bloated. Taxes are as low as they possibly can be, particularly when it comes to job creation, business creation, and having a thriving business sector. And if you do those things, you expand the size of the economy and all boats rise. The problem is if you just simply focus on transfer payments and trying to make everybody absolutely equal at every single turn, you end up with a very low incentive society and everybody suffers as a consequence. That's really just simple economics.
The Chancellor says that she's, I don't know if you saw the interview she did in the Times, but she said that she's sick of being mansplained to about how to be Chancellor. Do you think she's including you in that number of mansplainers?
I have no idea, but that is just smoke, mirrors and chaff to distract from the fact that the economy is in a terrible state. Look, all of these issues are nothing to do with gender. They're to do with economic mismanagement, and whether Rachel's a man or a woman, that
do you think she's patronised because she's a woman Chancellor?
Well, I'm certainly not by me. I can't account for everybody else who ever comments on the Chancellor in the media and so on and so forth. But the important point here is that this economy has been substantially mismanaged, and that is why we have a near, high level of unemployment, the highest in 5 years, anemic growth, inflation at almost double what it was when Labour took over, food inflation having risen from 4.5% to 4.9%, much higher than the headline rate of inflation, and people are really suffering as a consequence of those decisions.
Do you think this will be the Chancellor's last budget?
It's not for me to get my crystal ball out there as much as sometimes when I'm on with your colleague Nick Ferrari, he calls me Mystic Meg and says I should look into my crystal ball and wisely pronounce on the future. I think I'll resist that one.
You don't get that sort of obsequious treatment on this show.
No, clearly not. I've noticed that. Get the hair shirt.
Will they, just on one other thing, talking about the Chancellor, this budget, maybe it's her last budget. There's certainly lots of speculation about all of that. Will this be the Tories' last election as a major force? You'll have seen your own internal polling, seen by LBC, shows that the party is on course for just 14 seats at the next election.
First, as a point of accuracy, that is not polling that was commissioned by the Conservative Party, and I believe it actually related to last summer rather than today. But to the general point, look, we have got a journey that we've got to go on. We lost an election, a record loss for us. About 18 months ago, there was a visceral anger towards our party for a variety of reasons. What we've got to concentrate on under Kemi's leadership is holding this government to account. We're demonstrating that. I'm doing it on your show now with regard to the economy. We've held them to account on grooming gangs and getting a national inquiry going. We held them to account on Angela Rayner and Lord Mandelson and various issues, and Kemi is showing the lead there. But we've also got to come up with the answers to the fundamental challenges that our country faces, and we're doing that hard work, and we demonstrated at our conference that we could get government spending down, get taxes down by scrapping stamp duty on primary residences, take 250,000 small businesses out of business rates altogether, and have a big, bold offer for young people around that first job when they go into employment. So we will keep holding the government to account, doing the hard thinking, coming up with the grown-up solutions to the challenges we face, not the kind of reform answers where they, say whatever they think everybody wants to hear with no plan to back it up. And that is the direction that we're going in. The election, of course, will be in about 3.5 years' time.
Indeed, sir.
And let's come back in 3.5 years.
I'm sure we all are there. I'm sure we will. And we'll see if your reputation as a savant is vindicated. So, Mel Stride, thanks so much.
Thank you.
So Mel Stride there, the Shadow Chancellor. Of course, we'll be hearing a lot from him, I'm sure, on LBC and indeed everywhere else, as if there is such a place for the rest of the week. And it's a very important political and economic week, of course, for Rachel Reeves and indeed for the Conservative Party. Conservative Party, interestingly, pretty much its only kind of glimmer of hope is that you might think miraculously, given some of the things that happened, but actually, according to the polling, the Tory Party is still relatively trusted by comparison to Labour and Reform on the economy and getting growth into the economy. So that is something on which they would very much like to fight the election as things stand right now, at least.